Hello and welcome to the front page, where we delve into the biggest stories from the last week in racing. Coming up on today's show, we'll be reflecting on the return of racing at Cheltenham. We'll be looking back over the flat season, and we will be talking about Nick Rust, former BHA chief executive, telling racing it must be more radical if it's to overcome its challenges. To discuss all of that and much more, I'm delighted to be joined in the studio by front page regular Maddy Playle. How are you, Maddy?
Yeah, very well, thanks, Tom.
Celebrating your HWPA nominee?
Not quite. With a cup of tea, maybe.
With a cup of tea, quite right. And from his estate in the country, Deputy Industry Editor Peter Scargill. How are you, Pete?
Good morning. Yeah, had a nice ramble around the grounds this morning, so ready to get stuck into some interesting subjects. So.
Good man. How are the pheasants?
Delightful at this time of year.
Good. Okay, we're going to go straight into our first story, which is about the return of racing at Cheltenham. For many, the spiritual home of jumps racing, the national hunt season does not really begin until we are back at Prestbury Park. And we had 2 days of fantastic racing on Friday and Saturday. Proper good jumping ground, no issues there. Lots of competitors from across the big yards in Britain and Ireland. Maddy, what did you make of it? What was your highlight?
Loved it, Tom. I was really looking forward to it. I just feel like it's a change in pace, a change in pitch, something when Cheltenham comes back. It's something in the air. And I thought we saw some great performances on track. In the novice hurdle, Encanto Bruno was particularly impressive. Keith Donoghue, of course, he was one of the main talking points of the two-day meeting with his sort of very much sit and wait rides aboard my mate Mozzie.
Carberry style, yeah.
Yeah, very much so. And Flooring Porter, of course, we've got to talk about him, the Dual Stayers hurdle winner. He looked pretty good on his chasing debut, I think it has to be said. In terms of horses to follow, if you want to throw a few of those, I'll chuck them out there. I thought the 2 mile handicap chase won by Dancing on My Own, the Red Run winner. 2 in behind, Triple Trade stayed on from a mile back, and In Excelsis Deo was third as well. That was a really good effort from him. They could be looking at bigger races on the horizon for those pair. Often at those Cheltenham races, you see horses dominate from the front. They get into a rhythm and no one can catch them. So I always think when horses do make up ground from the back, it's worth taking note. Notable that Henry de Bromhead, he had a couple of winners on his birthday, no less, 2, and Gavin Cromwell, who is really, I think, one of the emerging forces in Irish racing, had 3. He'd inherited a couple of horses from John McConnell, and his string just seems to go from strength to strength. Interestingly, though, in the bumper, traditionally Irish would be strong there, and they couldn't lay a glove on that race. But yeah, it was really absorbing racing, and can't wait now for the November meeting next month.
Absolutely. Well, the Irish representation at the meeting was one of the big talking points going into it, and they delivered a pretty decent whole. They had 3 wins on Saturday, 2 wins on Friday. Of course, Gavin Cromwell having a fantastic meeting. A lot of people talking about how this meeting, the October meeting, used to kind of be a domestic affair, and now it has become a much bigger target for the Irish raiders. Is that just a testament to the gravitational pull of Cheltenham, or is that more to do with Irish racing's ascendancy in the jump sphere?
I think you could argue it's probably a bit of both. For as long as I've been in racing now anyway, it seems like Irish trainers have targeted this meeting, but certainly in the last couple of years it seems to have gone up a notch. And if, they do have largely the better horses, then they're going to be extremely competitive. I think trainers these days are becoming a lot more creative with their campaigning, and they're really honing in on what they'd like to do, whereas perhaps back in the day there would be a lot more perhaps say from the owners, or there'd be a lot more sort of wait and see approach. But these days there seems to be targets made from a long way out, even for these smaller races, the likes of that opener, the 2 mile conditional jockeys handicap hurdle. You just need to target these races from a long way out to be competitive, and I think that's representative, as you say, both the pull of Cheltenham and the atmosphere, which we saw was incredible after a couple of the wins, the Wacker Clan and Flooring Porter sort of spark festival-like scenes in the winners' enclosure, and also with Ben Pauling and Mole Court as well. Some really touching stories produced by the 2 days, which I just think you don't really seem to get many other places.
Yeah, we'll come back to the atmosphere in just a second there, because I think that was it was a definite highlight of the meeting for me. But if we talk about probably the highest profile horse on show, Flooring Porter, successful novice chase win. What did we make of it? What do we learn, more importantly?
It was an interesting decision to go chasing relatively late in his career. I think Edwardstone did the same. He was fairly old and he won an Arkle and went on to win a Tingle Creek. So it was interesting that for a horse who's won 2 Stayers hurdles, they thought, let's change tack, let's try something different. And he's just a fascinating horse to watch because he's always been quite quirky, whether he hangs or he jumps one way, jumps the other. He can be very keen. It seemed to go largely straightforward and to plan. He took a little bit of the chance at 2 of the open ditches, which we've seen other horses do. I know my beloved Thistlecrack, when he went to Cheltenham for the first time over fences, he did the same, very much dived at them. And I think that's just representative of what he's like as a horse. You know, he's just kind of all guns blazing and very absorbing to watch. But his class shone through in beating 2 very decent prospects from the Nigel Twiston Davis yard, Broadway Boy and We've All Been Caught. They're held in high regard. I don't think that was a gimme novice chase by any means. It'd be interesting to see if the pressure does come on his jumping a little bit more, but he's got the class. It's just whether he seems to be on a going day, and clearly they've worked out how to ride and campaign him as well, and he loves Cheltenham, so perhaps we'll see him next month.
Cheltenham, of course, is such a huge draw. Every meeting not only draws a good crowd, but people who are incredibly sort of energised. We heard that the reaction was, the atmosphere sounded fantastic. The festival atmosphere is almost spreading through the rest of the festival, the Cheltenham season. Great to see. Also, we had on, I think, the Saturday, I think there were 5,000 students in the Best Mate enclosure. They're from this organisation called Invades, which goes around different campuses around the country and sells tickets to direct to students, organises transport for them, puts on DJs and everything. I know they've also got another few coming. They've got a sold out one at Aintree next month as well. That's fantastic for the game, isn't it? Seeing so many young people, thousands of young people coming along, creating a brilliant atmosphere and having a superb time at the races.
Absolutely. I think that from some quarters there can be this cynicism of, oh, people just come to drink and have a nice time. I mean, is that a crime?
Is that bad?
Yeah. And we've actually covered a lot of what Invades have done before and spoke to some of the people involved, and ultimately at a time when racing is struggling to get people on the racecourse attending these fixtures, and B, new fans, you know, this is the perfect opportunity, and it seems to be working really well.
Pete, one of the other interesting stories that came out, our own West Country correspondent James Stevens, a very interesting story about some changes to the betting ring at Cheltenham, talking about reducing the number of on-course bookmakers who can stand there. A bit of controversy around it, including whether it means that some people who have paid for pitches might not be able to stand. But one of the other things that came out of it was this sort of theme that some of the on-course bookies sort of bemoaning the death of the ring. What did you make of that tale?
You read my mind, Tom. That's exactly what I wanted to talk about. It's, and I think as a general, racecourse bookmakers can have a bit of a moan. They like a bit of a moan, and they like to, put forward a certain way of things. And I'm not saying it's not true, but they, often when they are speaking up, it's to have a bit of a moan about things. The Cheltenham betting ring is almost held up as this sort of fantasy betting ring, isn't it? It's the place where all the people come in. It's the huge amounts of money in. It's the Freddie Williams versus JP McManus thing. But I don't know. I mean, in general, betting rings are shrinking, aren't they? And James's article, he was talking about the flow around the course and things like that have changed. And I think that there's probably something in that. It's more of a walk to get up to the top of the hill where the bookies stand up there. But I don't know. I mean, everyone's got a betting app in their pocket, don't they, in the end? And they can get lots of concessions betting online. So I don't know. There needs to be more offered on course to get people to come and have the bet rather than it just being a traditional thing. It would be a shame to see it reduced. And those people who are in a position where they paid lots of money to stand, potentially being in the podium, that's more than enough reason to have a moan. But there needs to be more done by them to attract the people, if that is what's happening. Do you see what I mean? It can't just be the case of, we're here, people have always bet with us. There needs to be more often, because people do like to bet on the course. They do like to bet in cash. Racecourses being cashless has made that more difficult to some extent, but they need to really strive to deliver more to the punters, and if they do that, then they will be able to sustain a ring of relative size.
The other story I wanted to talk to you about, Pete, was something which was covered, in fact, in our news show, The Morning Post, every Saturday morning at 10 a.m. live. Paul Keeley wrote a very interesting piece last week, initially on an email newsletter, but then published on the website, and then he spoke about it on The Morning Post, about what he called FOMC, Fear of Missing Cheltenham, which he says is ruining jumps racing. And of course, he's not talking about the showcase meeting, he is talking about the festival in March, basically saying that trainers and owners are so obsessed with making that 1 week in March that they're barely running outside of it, and it is turning the 5 months that precede the festival into a bit of a sham. What did you make of that, Pete?
I thought you were going to talk to me about low sun at Aintree, Tom. That's the proper sign of the jumps racing's return. There's no jumps racing happening when no jumps going on. No, in terms of what Paul said, I mean, look, he's right, isn't he? It's been a continuing trend, and these guys, Mullins and Elliott and Henderson and Nichols and many other trainers, are so good at peaking their horses to be in the best possible condition on a big day, that it makes sense to have them in the best possible condition for the big day. And we all know that the Cheltenham Festival is the big shot window. It's where it gets the most attention in terms of the media, it gets most attention in terms of casual viewers. It's an inevitable consequence of what's happened in terms of Cheltenham being made this into this huge thing, and I would argue the centralisation of so many good horses in so few hands, because Winnie Mullins doesn't need to send his horses to the course to decide who's better. He knows already, so he can just pick his routes and decide what's going on. So, I mean, you guys talked about how this weekend's meeting at Cheltenham was highly enjoyable, and there was big crowds and all that sort of stuff. And perhaps that's the way people have to approach the jump season now. Outside the big meetings, maybe the King George meeting and the Cheltenham Festival over here, and maybe the Dublin Racing Festival and the meeting at Leopardstown at Christmas in Ireland, we have to accept that the big horses won't be running. That's the reality of it, and we have to make do with the other horses, perhaps more of the novices who are learning their trade, to get the enjoyment out of it. I just, the genie is out of the bottle. The stable door is well open, and the horses have galloped across Prestbury Hill. I mean, that's how I see it. I mean, I don't know what you think, Tom. Obviously, I know it's something you've chronicled before in the past.
Well, yeah. I mean, I kind of think that the period from now through to Christmas, New Year is fantastic. Yes, we probably don't see the top horses quite as often as we'd like to, but they do come out, and really, I don't know, Maddy, it's that period, sort of New Year's Day onwards through to Cheltenham, that particularly in Britain is pretty quiet.
Yeah, I wrote about this last week actually before the showcase meeting, and I said the exact same thing, that I prefer this time of the year due to all that uncertainty, due to lots of competitive races like the Great Wood Hurdle, the Paddy Power, just to name a few. It's not only exclusive to Cheltenham. And how I prefer it, because I just find the Cheltenham hype, it goes on for such a long time, and we already know who's won the key races. You just feel like you're waiting and waiting for them to appear, whereas at this time of year, will that horse who we saw over hurdles, everything he did over hurdles have indeed been a bonus, or will, where will the superstars come from that we weren't expecting them to this year? But for me, I think the Cheltenham centric attitude, it's something that I've spoken to a few trainers about, and I think it could be linked with sort of modernisation of training itself and getting horses to a completely new level of fitness. I know Dan Skelton's a big believer in this, and now that whenever you go to the races, even if it's not a big meeting, horses are fully tuned up for the day, and you can only really extract that level of performance from a horse 2 to 3 times a year if it stays sound, which, as we know, is an incredibly difficult thing to do with these fragile animals. So, you just simply can't compete if you're not at that level. And if you do try, then it's going to be to your detriment later on the season. I mean, I think it was when I spoke to him after one of the Dublin Racing Festivals, and I was saying, why don't you send horses over there? And he said, well, with the amount of, it's not, they're not going to the Breeders' Cup, but with the travel involved and the ground, particularly for that fixture, can often be quite testing. He was sort of saying, why would you sacrifice pretty much your whole season to compete on that one day? And as you say, the attitudes of trainers and owners now are to focus on Cheltenham. But I think back in the day when you'd have horses like Flaky Dove, didn't she run 9 times before she won a champion hurdle or something stupid? You just can't do that because trainers aren't turning up to the track now and leaving their horse with that much to work on. Yes, I'm sure they're going to improve, but the season doesn't work in the same way, and everyone's working to a totally different level, that it would not be beneficial to work in that way. I'm not saying it's necessarily true, but that's the argument that Dan and I think Paul have made, is that this view is, yes, it's attitudes and changes have been made there, but also advances in fitness and how fit these horses have to be, and how they extract optimum performance from them for a couple of minutes for one day in March.
Yeah, it's fascinating. I think you're absolutely right. Ed Chamberlain was also very interesting in this in the big jump off, talking about some of the problems around Cheltenham, but also reflecting that, thank God we have Cheltenham. What a fantastic focal point of the season it is. We were reminded of that when we were back there at the weekend, and it is going to be something which we discuss at great length on this show and elsewhere, because at the end of the day, while we might bemoan its gravitational pull, we all actually also love the festival. So we'll be returning to that subject ad infinitum, no doubt. But we're going to move on very shortly. Just before we do, a quick plug for our latest changes to our app. If you haven't downloaded it or haven't used it lately, you must give it a go again. We've made some massive changes to our race cards, introducing 3 different types of race cards for all different types of users. Give it a look, have a look at this advert and check it out.
You spoke, we listened. Introducing Race Cards Redefined. 3 brand new and unique race cards tailored for your needs. Our new and improved standard race card is the punter's favourite and is everything you need to make your selection. Get the maximum amount of information in the palm of your hand with Expert View. Cover all areas and get all the same information as our newspaper. With Compact View, you can make a quick decision on who to back. View more runners and more odds on one race. Which race card will you choose?
Okay, welcome back. We were also looking at some action on the flat at the weekend. We had the last Grip 1 of the British season, and for Godolphin it was a welcome return to a Grip 1 winners' enclosure. They had Agent Wisdom in the Futurity, just their second domestic Grip 1 of the season, the first since a Lockinge, unbelievably. But if it had been quite a quiet and perhaps underwhelming season for Godolphin, for many others it was a fantastic year, none more so than that man Frankie Dettori, whose year-long retirement tour went so well he decided not to retire at all. Pete, let's reflect on the flat season just been. What was your highlight and lowlight?
Well, what was my highlight and lowlight? Oh, there we are. I think the highlight has to be, and it's a slightly sneaky one in this sense, but I think the highlight is the 2-year-old talent that we've seen in the last month or so. I think this season we have had sort of stars that come in and have shone very brightly for a very short period of time, like Ace Impact and Paddington and Soul Sister and Shaquille. They've all come in and done really well, and they're all, well, Soul Sister should be better next year, but they're all off the start, and we kind of went, we like these horses, they've disappeared. But with some of these 2-year-olds, we've got to know them already, the likes of City of Troy and Van Dijk and Ylang and Ancient Wisdom, obviously, at the weekend. All these horses offer real intrigue and excitement for next year. So can that count as a highlight, a collective highlight? Is that allowed?
I think
Or do I have
that
to be
is
more
allowed.
specific?
I think that's allowed, Pete. You're allowed to say that the 2-year-olds, the 2-year-old talent, City of Troy, Ancient Wisdom, these are exciting horses. And what is the flat for, if not dreaming of tomorrow's champions? Because today's champions have been retired. What about your low light, Pete?
Oh, I think it was something that was put across by Chris Cook in his column last week. I think this sort of the whip stuff just taking the edge off some of these big meetings. Obviously, the big one being that fantastic race between Hookham and Westover in the King George that ended up with Jim Crowley being really, really close to losing the race, and Frankie's 16-day ban for his 2 rides on Champions Day. It's just a shame to have that sting in the tail all of the time. It's just I'm with Chris in that there perhaps needs to be some more nuancing going on around this, because you've got these fantastic races. I don't think anyone was offended by any of them, and then at the end, you're writing stories about people getting significant bans. So I would say that's a low light. Again, that's a sort of a wider one. But I'm a guy that likes to see the big picture.
Yeah, if Frankie Dettori's retirement tour had remained a retirement tour and he'd got a 16-day ban, which was taking him out of the majority of the rest of it, that certainly would have been a big controversy. Maddy, you a highlight and low light?
I've got a couple of highlights, if I can. Just indulge me.
Of
We're
course.
going back to March, but there's no Cheltenham Festival in this. I was lucky enough to be out in Dubai and to see Equinox win the Shima Classic, which has turned out to be one of the best form lines I think we've ever seen on the flat. And admittedly, I was scribbling away, writing my reports, so I didn't get to go down and actually see the atmosphere as he came back in. But I watched the race and my jaw just dropped. I mean, you don't see horses win races that competitively in that style on the bridle. And I think everyone who was there had a real sense of what have we just seen. So that was fantastic. For a horse like him to start on World Cup night, when the World Cup, I feel like it's been a bit of a forgotten race, almost, with Ushba Tesoro winning, and he could go on to win the Breeders' Cup Classic. But anyway, and my other one, we all know I'm a bit of a romantic at heart and we love a story, and I spoke to Sean Curran before Living the Dream's Nunthorpe success, and he'd only just ridden out his claim. He'd been up and down the country riding for different people. Connections had given him this chance. No one, without being disrespectful, seemed to think he had much of a shot. I think the horse was about 40-1 at the time, and he was just absolutely fantastic. He was so engaging, and really just one of those phone calls that you have where you find your job a real joy. And I found myself thoroughly rooting for him, Adam West, and the Dilemmoses, and you couldn't have written it any better. Yeah. I just love the fact that it's an Epsom yard, it's a smaller yard, a jockey who, has been given a chance and they've kept loyal to him. And I thought it was all executed perfectly. And again, hopefully we'll be able to see that story continue in the Breeders' Cup, because if I had to pick a low light, it would be these horses going off to stud, and the likes of Ace Impact would never see that clash with Equinox, and so many others as well. Paddington, it makes me really sad, because there's just a sense of what might have been. We never really get to the bottom of these horses, and ultimately, is that not what the flat is about? I mean, these days it seems to be about who can have the best, stud prospects, rather than what you are as a racehorse, and getting to the bottom of that and really finding out your limitations.
Twas ever thus, say people in response to that, and totally fair, because it is, and you can't really get away from it. And to be honest, I think if we all sort of sit there and think, well, if I owned these horses and I was looking at, on the one hand, a guaranteed 20-year income from stud versus the complete uncertainty and peril of continuing to race, you'd be sorely tempted, if not completely mad, to do anything other than go to stud. However, the Arc winner, perfect example of this. That perfect campaign, culminating with a brilliant win at Longchamp, and you're just desperately thinking, God, I would love to see this horse go on next year, take on some more big challenges, and help us find out the depth of the talent. Is he the best since Frankel? Is he as good as Frankel? We will never know. And it is one of the abiding frustrations.
I think with him as well, it was quite a unique scenario in that he came from nowhere really and won quite a few lowly races before being stepped up. So it's not like he went to the Irish Champion Stakes, for instance, where he was entered there. That would have told us more about him. Or if he went to the Breeders' Cup or Hong Kong or anywhere, if he travelled one more big Group 1, maybe over a different distance, would have taught us more. But it's just, we don't really know much about him, even now. Yeah.
Flat season not quite done though, of course. We've still got some huge international meetings, America, Hong Kong, Australia. Breeders' Cup, Friday and Saturday this week. We'll have all the coverage on the Racing Post and in the newspaper. Chris Cook's out there for us. What are you looking forward to most at Santa Anita?
Living the dream.
Living the dream?
Just because it's a fantastic story, and yeah, I think it would be great for racing to be able to shout about a story like that. The Breeders' Cup Turf is going to be a belting race as well, but yeah, I'll stick to my Living the Dream story.
Pete, I'm absolutely loving the fact Mick Appleby's got his first run out there with Big Evs. What are you looking forward to?
Oh, the whole thing. I'm a big Breeders' Cup man, although it is tinged with a little bit of anxiety given the breakdowns we've had at the big American meetings this year. I hope it's a meeting that goes off clean in that respect. I'm looking forward to Morge in the Breeders' Cup Mile. I like Saeed Bin Surur. He's a good old boy. So I think that could be quite a good race. Obviously, she was good in the QE2 at Keenan last time. So I'm looking forward to her. And talking of the QE2, obviously the flat season this year also showed us how engaged the King and Queen are in racing, which is always a good thing to know going forward.
Absolutely. One for the monikers there. Before we move on to our final story, a quick advert for our latest Members Club Ultimate offer. Welcome back. Our final story this week concerns some comments made last week by Nick Rust, the former chief executive of the BHA. Nick was speaking at a conference in London on gambling regulation, and for the first time since leaving the BHA in 2020, he gave some candid and in-depth assessments of where the sport is and what it has to do to prosper in future. There were very interesting comments. Nick Rust, as someone who's formerly worked for a bookmaker and who has been at the top of racing for many years, is in this tiny, tiny intersection of people who truly understand the complexities and maddening idiosyncrasies of the betting and racing industries and how they interact. So he truly understands how complex and challenging it is to get things done. So his diagnosis of the problems was, as you would expect, extremely thorough. His prescription for the sport was more radical changes. He said what's been done by the BHA and others with premierisation and the introduction of premier fixtures was a step in the right direction, but he said the swords are hanging over these proposals. They're time limited, and if they do not succeed, they'll be rolled back. And he said, in fact, the sport had to go further. It had to look even more closely about how it could be structured efficiently for participant costs and to maximise betting revenues. Pete, you were there at the conference in London's Barbican Centre. What did you make of the speech?
Well, it was good to hear from him. Like you say, it's the first time since he left in 2020 that we've had the chance to hear his views. We don't get sort of prominent former BHA people speaking too often. We had Paul Roy come forward last year to express some concerns on the matters, and now we've got Nick Rust coming in to add his, like you say, I mean, a detailed view, and a man who is engaged in both industries or has been engaged in both industries, so he knows what he's talking talking about. What struck me was how passionate he was about it. The points were slamming the table and saying, we need to sort out what's going on here, and the Gambling Commission needs to address what's going on in the black market. This is a guy that hasn't just taken up an offer to come and have a chat, and he's chatting away for half an hour or so. He's a guy that really wants to get his message across. It was impactful. It was heartfelt, if that's the right word. It came from the heart in that sense. And he's a guy that clearly wants to see racing prosper. And sometimes when he was in charge of the BHA, he had a habit of putting his foot in his mouth a little bit when he spoke. I don't know whether being unshackled and having that time to sort of step away and gather his thoughts has given him the opportunity to lay them out a bit more clearly and concisely. But I thought a lot of the ideas were very good in terms of longer race cards, regionalised meetings to make sure that to cut down on costs and make things more efficient. Things like starter yards for new trainers. Going back to the point we discussed earlier about the superpowers. I mean, if people aren't given the opportunities to come in and to make it work financially, then people owners are going to be drawn more towards the larger, more established setups, and you lose the competitiveness and the colour as a result of that. I mean, that's what came across to me. Obviously, you were there as well, Tom, and you had a chance to take it in. Did you come away sort of feeling the same, or was there some more nuances that you picked up on it?
No, I mean, I've always thought Nick is someone whose passion for the sport shone through. Perhaps sometimes that got him into trouble because he was so happy to speak and sometimes speak in a slightly speculative manner rather than in a politician's answer, if you like. I thought some of his policies were certainly more radical than anything he espoused when he was in power. Perhaps the most eye-catching was this idea that there should be a 15% cut to the number of races, which would obviously have quite significant consequences. If we're then talking about longer race cards as well, I think that where that leads you to is fewer race courses. So I guess if you were going to be a critic, a cynic, you would say, where were these proposals when he was in power? But of course, that was the other thing Nick spoke to, which was the complexity, the difficulty of getting anything done in racing because of its power structures. And it's kind of the main achievement, I think, of the current administration thus far is not so much the changes they've introduced, although they're welcome, but still untested. It's the fact that they managed to get all these disparate factions in the sport to agree to something which is relatively radical. Because as we know, Pete, that's been borderline impossible over the years. The power of veto has been wielded with impunity.
Yes, death by veto. Don't get anything done because anyone who doesn't like anything, they just say it stopped. I mean, you're right. The fact that they have been able to implement some changes for next year's fixture list with premierisation and the better use of Sundays and all these things that we need to see how they work out. You couldn't almost imagine that a year ago, could you? When they were sitting down to have this big get together in a London hotel to figure out what they were going to do. So it's definitely an achievement. But you don't know. We need to see something come of them, and I think that's as much as what Nick was saying. Because, he's seen the problems, he knows what's coming, and we've got the old Gambling Commission looming. The Gambling Review looming over us like a spectre. If I can bring some Halloween-esque commentary to things, so it's all coming together, isn't it?
Yes. Well, I mean, Maddy, we've been here before, haven't we? The number of times we've spoken on this show in our run about the problems which bedevil racing's structure and the inability to get things done. What do you think about where the sport's going right now? Has it been radical enough? Has it been too radical, as some believe?
No, certainly not too radical. I definitely agreed with Nick's arguments and some of the suggestions. I think Pete listed them there: longer race cards, regionalised fixtures, development of infrastructure and training centres, etc., etc., and also primarily to collaborate and radicalise the fixture list to a different degree. Not to pour cold water on the whole thing, but we know these are radical and the impacts they could have on the sport. But realistically, I don't think anyone's under any illusions that whether they can actually be made. So it kind of seems like we're all just getting used to shouting into the void about what we want, but it's not actually going to be constructive if it can never actually happen. Now, I appreciate Nick's coming from a position where he knows that and he recognises the nuances of this, but even with the new industry strategy, I'm not yet prepared to say that I can confidently invest in these ideas, because it's never worked that way previously, and I still think there's an awful lot that racing needs to collaborate more effectively on. So as much as it's good to hear someone as you say, as passionate and as invested and as knowledgeable as Nick talk about possible solutions to racing problems, can we ever get to a space where they can actually be implemented? I'm not so sure. So I would like to see the things that he mentioned, but whether I will actually see them is another question altogether.
I think that's a reminder, though, that needs to be constantly reiterated, that racing needs to work together, that this sort of fragile unity which brought about some of the changes which have been laid out by the BHA and the rest of sport this year is so important, because paralysis and the inattention that brings to the problems which the sport has to grapple with, is going to lead racing to a pretty bleak place. It needs to evolve, it needs to try new things, and it needs to have bold leadership.
Yeah, exactly. And I think putting pressure on racing's leaders and all those different groups, I guess, can only be a good thing. Drawing their attention to the problems of the gambling review, of the white paper, of issues with attendances, of competitiveness of racing, betting incomes, etc., etc. That can only be a good thing, I suppose, if you do want to take a more slightly positive view on it. And I guess the main takeaway for me is we just need to continue talking about these things. And racing has some incredibly knowledgeable, passionate people who want it to succeed. And the more we can hear from them and the more they can collaborate together, the more promising its future. But equally, they have to be in a position where they are allowed to inflict change.
Yeah, well said, Maddy. That's all we've got time for this week, which leaves me with the simple task of deciding what's going to go on the front page. Nick Rust's comments were enormously newsworthy and important, and of course, they did make our front page, but they're not going on the front page this week, and nor is the flat season review. It can only be the return of Cheltenham and the beginning of the National Hunt season in earnest. It's great to have it back, and we will be covering it at length on this show in the weeks and months to come. Thank you so much to Maddy and Pete, my fantastic guests, for discussing all the big stories today, and thank you very much for tuning in. Please do leave your comments, subscribe and like, and tune in again next week for more discussion on the front page. Goodbye.